Hey guys, I'm here today at the National Prisoner of War Museum in Andersonville, Georgia. I just wanted to take a look around. Gonna do some videos and pictures. This is put together by ex-prisoners of war and the Friends of Andersonville. So we're gonna go check it out.
Hi, my name is Sherry and I'm a ranger here at Andersonville National Historic Site. So today I'm going to talk a tiny bit about the site and just give you some of the highlights. The site was first here in the Civil War. It was a prison camp for Union prisoners of the Confederacy. So all of the men who passed away here were Union soldiers. The site was originally started in January of 1864, and the first prisoners came on site February of 1864. It was only meant to hold about 8,000 to 10,000 men, but by May and June of 1864, it had already exceeded 26,000. And so the situation here was very, very dire. And unfortunately, the stream that ran through the stockade that provided water for the prisoners was very small, very sluggish, and they had camped the guards upstream. So they were also using that stream, as they should at the time, for drinking, washing, and latrines. And then it flowed into the stockade. The stockade wall itself is anywhere from 15 to 17 feet high, and each post goes into the ground 5 feet. So that also impeded the outflow of the stream. So it really backed up and created like a 5-acre swamp of sewage. So it was really terrible for these guys, and that's what caused a lot of the deaths here, was illness from the stream. Diarrhea was number one cause of death here. Number two was scurvy, so the lack of fruits and vegetables, they could not get enough vitamin C. And then number three was dysentery, which again comes with a lot of intestinal distress. So you can imagine what the site looked like. In July, they decided they need to expand because with it being 16 and a half acres with that 26,000, it left each man about 2.07 square feet to survive, because you had to take off 3 acres for the deadline and 5 acres for the swamp. So once they expanded it by 10 acres, then the deadline took up 5 and the swamp took up 5. So it was down about back to 16 and a half. That gave each man approximately the size of a twin mattress, because by August of 64, there were 33,006 men on this site. So it was really, I think it was the 4th largest city by population in the Confederacy at the time, just due to the amount of people. So it was open for 14 months, but during that 14 months, 45,000 men passed through the gates. And of that 45,000, 12,920 lost their lives here. It's a death rate of about 29%. So it does make us the most notorious prison site in the Civil War. It is the deadliest ground in all of the Civil War. More men died on that field than died in Gettysburg and Antietam combined, and that's deaths, not casualties. So because of that, we have a national cemetery. They did inter those men individually, but in trench graves. So they would dig a big trench, about 50 to 100 feet long. They would lay them shoulder to shoulder. They could not afford to bury wood, so they did not have coffins because they needed that wood for survival, for cooking, for heat, that kind of thing, building. And so they would lay them shoulder to shoulder, and then they'd cover them over. They would put a post at the head of each man that had a number on it, and that number correlated to a book that was kept in the hospital called the death register. So they would put down what information they had on each man in that death register and by number, and then they would place that number at the head of each man when they buried him. After the war was over, they confiscated that book that was here, another one that had been here as well. One of them had been secreted out by a young prisoner who was paroled to work in the hospital, Dorrance Atwater, and then they also confiscated one from up north. And so they were able to put those three together and make more of a concise list of the men here. They came back very quickly. The war ended May, June, depending on which state you're looking at. And by July, they had sent Captain Moore here to establish Andersonville. Captain Moore had already established Arlington, Battlefield, Spotsylvania. And so he was very, very good at this. He came in and they were here for 6 weeks. He removed all of those posts and, according to number, made headboards, boards that were painted white with black lettering to name each soldier, aside from the ones that were unknown. And then about 10 years later, they came back and put in the stones that you see today. So those stones are about 150 years old. Initially, the unknown soldiers were marked with just a chunk of square with a number on the top. Actually, one of those is in that center case down there. You can actually see the post that came out of the ground for the unknowns. When the stones came in a little bit later, they started putting unknown stones in as well. There are about 450 to 460, we don't know the exact number, of unknown soldiers. So if you think about it, during the Civil War, out of 12,920, only 450 to 60 unknowns is really, really quite remarkable.
Yeah, that's not bad considering the lack of technology.
It is, and they didn't wear dog tags. In fact, that's one of the reasons they started wearing dog tags later, was because they wanted this to never happen again.
Right.
So the federal government knew they were going to have to create a lot of these cemeteries. So there are a lot of these federal Civil War cemeteries around, and that's because in the first year of the Civil War, more men died than they had cemeteries to bury them in.
Oh, wow.
Though they were not expecting it to be what it was. And the same with Andersonville. It was not created as a death camp. It was created as a holding place, and then they were supposed to do exchanges. But when the exchange system broke down after the Emancipation Proclamation, then they started coming in 400 to 600 a day, and then none were going out. And so that's kind of what happened. They were allotted about 10,000 pounds of food a day, no matter how many soldiers were here. And so if you think about August being 33,000 soldiers and only 10,000 pounds of very poor rations, it's less than a third of a pound per man. So you can see why the death rate was so high. And so the cemetery, they came in and they did that, and then the Army, Department of the Army, decided they wanted to make all of them very, very uniform. So they built brick walls around each one. It's the same brick wall. If you go to other cemeteries like that, you will see that the brick wall is the same design. They found that the ground here, the clay that's here, made really, really good bricks. So they actually built a kiln on site, and they kilned all the bricks for that brick wall.
Oh, wow.
On site. Yeah, our guys go to special training. We call in experts to come and repoint that wall to make sure it's taken care of. So that brick wall itself is 160 years old. The trees, a lot of the trees are around 150. And so it really is like walking into a time capsule. Even our headquarters, which is now the headquarters building, was the old cemetery superintendent building. They are all made the same too. They're built in an L shape. Our porch is now closed in to make another office. But if you look at other offices or those buildings that are in other cemeteries, they're the same exact shape, the same exact design. They kept everything very consistent. So, yeah. But one of the other things that is really cool about here is the effect that the Women's Relief Corps had. So after the war was over, the Grand Army of the Republic wanted to come in and make this place a place to remember so it wouldn't be forgotten. So they bought it, and after a lot of little haggling, they bought it, and they took care of it for about 5 years, and they found it was a lot more difficult to do than they thought it was going to be. So they turned to their auxiliary, which was the Women's Relief Corps. Now during the Civil War, the women had been very good at procuring items and the logistics of getting those things places, because that's how they helped take care of their men, their brothers, their husbands, their sons who were fighting. And it stayed with them. They were very good at it. So the Women's Relief Corps came in. They sold it to, they bought it from the Guard for $1.
Oh, wow.
And then they set to taking care of it. They bought 15 more acres. They bought up all of the earthworks and the rifle pits. They built a guest house so that veterans who were coming to do monuments could stay there. Anyone was welcome to stay there at any time.
Is that the building that's out there?
It isn't, unfortunately. It is in the same spot.
Okay.
But the original guest house was a 9-room farmhouse, New England style farmhouse. It was amazing, and it was taken down in the late 50s because of disrepair. And so the women took care of it until about the 1930s, and then they found that it was a little more difficult to do, at increasing cost and that kind of thing. They planted all the trees out here, all the pecans. They planted 200 pecan trees, knowing that eventually they would produce and they'd be able to sell the fruit and then put the money back into the park. So a lot of those pecans are 140, 150 years old. And so they really had an idea of what they were doing. They really wanted to be what it is. They're the ones that had that gate, as you go out the exit, that white fence, that white gate, that they put that up. And then in the 30s, they had the Army take over, and they sent in the CCC, so the Conservation Corps came in. They had a camp across the street from the cemetery gates that is still there today. We use it as our primitive Boy Scout camp now. And they came in and they did a lot of improvements. So they improved the bridges so that cars could drive over them. They built all the stone walls that you see, and the ditches, the drainage ditches, are also historical. So they were all done in the 30s with the CCC. So this place is just like full of history from every generation. It's amazing. And so they turned it over to the Army. And in the 1970s, the Army said, you know, this isn't really what we do. It's not a battlefield. And so they asked if they thought we'd be better served by the National Park Service. So in 1970, we became an official National Historic Site underneath the umbrella of the National Park Service. So yeah, so that's a very concise history of the place. Now, the last thing is, because of all of this that happened here, they felt it would be a really great place to have the National Prisoner of War Museum. So we are a national museum, pretty much in the middle of nowhere, which was intentional on the part of the Confederate soldiers or the Confederate government. And so this Prisoner of War Museum encompasses all prisoners throughout American history. And it is not chronological. It walks you through the steps of a prisoner of war. So as you go through the museum, you start at what is a prisoner of war, and you go through service and capture and communication, morale, all those things, and you come out at homecoming. But there are artifacts in each room according to theme from each war. So it's a pretty amazing place, and it's a great place to work. So, yeah.
So, thank you so much.
Oh,
This is the cemetery for all of the men who died at Andersonville Prisoner of War Camp.